At 0600, on a flat grey morning in early March 1943, Admiral Masata Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his convoy cut a precise line through seas the Imperial Navy believed it controlled. 8 transports, escorted by several destroyers and smaller warships, moved on a timetable that had been rehearsed to the point of routine. The men aboard those transports were mostly soldiers bound for the bloody, slow work of holding and supplying forward garrisons in New Guinea. To Kimura and his staff, the formation was standard practice. Maintain discipline, trust the anti-aircraft umbrella, repel any attackers with layered fire and evasive maneuvering. The naval doctrine that had governed these convoys had survived testing and refinement through months of attrition. On this morning, that doctrine would be tested as never before. In Brisbane, more than 1,000 miles away, a different scene unfolded. Under a sun-scorched hangar roof at Eagle Farm Airfield, a small team of mechanics bent over medium bomber noses, measuring, reinforcing, and improvising. At their center was Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn, a one-time Navy pilot whose official title mattered less than the stubborn, hands-on ingenuity he brought to every metal shaper and bolt. Gunn had seen what conventional doctrine failed to account for, how the physics of fire and steel could be turned against ships not by a single brilliant official program, but by patient, practical modification in the field. The modification began modestly. Extra guns bolted into place as necessity and opportunity allowed. 4 guns became 6, and 6 became 8. Each step solved problems and created new ones. Recoil, weight distribution, sighting stability, until the B-25 that left Eagle Farm carried a nose lined with 8 50-caliber machine guns, a concentration of rapid fire that would redefine what a medium bomber could do over the sea. If the title of this study sounds hyperbolic, how the B-25's 8-gun noses turned the tide in naval battles, that is deliberate. The point is not that a single field modification won the vast Pacific War. The point is that, in a theater where supply was the hard arithmetic of victory and defeat, an improvised change in weapons and tactics could wreck carefully constructed logistics, force doctrine to adapt, and accelerate strategic consequences far beyond its immediate tactical effect. On a spring morning in the Bismarck Sea, the synthesis of 8 50-caliber barrels, new ammunition, and low-level skip bombing smashed a convoy plan that the Imperial Navy had relied on. It did so by creating a blend of suppression and precision that shipboard gunners were ill-prepared for, and by doing so in a way that multiplied damage rather than scattering it. If you like deep military technology stories, tap like. It helps this one reach more viewers. Japanese convoy doctrine in early 1943 was not the product of a single mind, but of experience and institutional assumptions. The Imperial Navy understood the air threat. It had been forced to. Their escorts deployed layered anti-aircraft defenses, and their formations emphasized mutual support. For months, air attacks tended to fall into a predictable set of outcomes. High-altitude bombing runs, often missed due to the difficulty of hitting narrow ship targets from altitude. Torpedo attacks could be effective, but required low, straight runs that risked the attacking aircraft to escorting fighters and accurate ship fire. And repeated attacks from afar had taught ship captains to rely on maneuver, discipline, and concentrated flak to drive off attackers without catastrophic loss. That calculus assumed a particular balance of force. Aircraft could be met with shipboard gunnery, and ships, with their armor compartments and trained crews, could absorb or repel punishment. What those assumptions did not factor well was a weapon system that combined the suppression of heavy machine gunnery with the accuracy necessary to place ordnance at the weakest point of a ship, the waterline. The B-25 Mitchell was not originally designed as a ship killer in this concentrated way. As a medium bomber, it was versatile, reliable, and adaptable. Gunn and the mechanics at Eagle Farm saw in that adaptability an opportunity. Mount a concentrated forward battery of 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Pair them with ammunition optimized for penetration and incendiary effect, most notably the M8 armor-piercing incendiary, M8 API rounds, and couple that firepower with a delivery tactic that placed bombs against ship hulls like bouncing stones. The result was a new class of weapon, the Strafer, a gun-equipped medium bomber that could suppress shipboard defenses and place bombs where they mattered. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn was not an engineer in any formal sense. He was a practical man who had spent years in the Navy, then in civilian flying and maintenance work. In Brisbane, he found an ad hoc laboratory, veteran mechanics, spare parts from damaged aircraft, the spare time and pressure of war that encourages improvisation. North American Aviation had sent Jack Fox as a field representative, an intermediary who could translate factory constraints into field solutions. Together, the group worked through iterations. Early attempts to mount extra guns faced simple but stubborn problems. The B-25's nose was designed to house bombardier equipment and forward guns. Bolting in more barrels meant rethinking the nose's structure. Recoil from 8 50 caliber guns produced significant force. The cumulative weight shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward. Sighting systems and aiming were complicated by the pilot's perspective and by the need for coordinated bursts. The team's engineering answers were direct and inventive. They reinforced the nose structure with additional bracing and plate to distribute recoil loads. Armor plate and thicker skins were added where guns mounted into the skin of the aircraft to prevent deformation. Wiring and feed mechanisms were reworked so that belts of ammunition could reach the guns reliably while minimizing jams. Ammunition types were selected for effect. The M2 Browning 50 caliber fired a heavy bullet at high muzzle velocity. Verify for precise standard muzzle velocity values in this specific field configuration. The M8 API rounds combined penetrative capacity with incendiary filler, capable of punching through lightly armored plating, igniting fuel, and exposing interior flammable materials. A practical note: armor-piercing incendiary means the round could perforate thin metal and ignite softer materials behind it. A single M2 could fire around 750 to 850 rounds per minute in sustained bursts under ideal conditions. Verify exact rate of fire figures when applied under field sustainment and cooling constraints. Multiply that by 8 barrels firing simultaneously, and the resulting curtain of lead and incendiary was not just damage, it was suppression, an active denial zone across the forward face of a ship. Suppression matters in naval engagements because ships are small, crude objects with limited reaction time. A destroyer's bridge is an exposed, constricted space where the commanding officer and rangefinders sit. Anti-aircraft crews are clustered around mounts with a thin margin for error. A concentrated burst of 50 caliber fire does 2 things immediately. It physically cuts and ignites unarmored superstructure and equipment, and it disrupts human systems, rangefinders, gunners, command and control. The timing of fire that Gunn and his colleagues perfected was short and brutal. Field accounts and tactical write-ups indicate that strafing runs typically opened fire at ranges between roughly 1,200 and 1,500 yards, long enough that the aircraft remained outside the immediate envelope of many AA systems initially, yet close enough to deliver effective hits. Crews would unleash an intensive burst lasting on the order of several seconds. Commonly, an 8-second window is cited in after-action reconstructions. Approximately 8 seconds of continuous concentrated fire, but mark this as verify for precise doctrinal timing, and then transition into bomb delivery with skip bombs that struck at or near the waterline. Skip bombing itself was a craft learned at sea-level altitudes and at speeds that minimized chance for shipboard correction. Instead of diving or dropping vertically from altitude, the attacking aircraft approached at very low levels, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the waves, released a bomb at a shallow angle and moderate speed so that it skipped across the surface and struck the hull. The greatest tactical advantage of skip bombing was the placement of the bomb against the ship's vulnerable waterline. A hull breach at that band invites rapid flooding and can tip a vessel from operational to dead in the water in minutes. But skip bombing required precise seamanship. Approach speed, release point, bomb arming distances and altitude all had to be coordinated to ensure a skip rather than a miss. When paired with strafing from 8-barrel noses, the method became far deadlier. The guns pinned and shredded the superstructure and the gun mounts, while the bombs found the hull. Crucially, the 8-gun nose did not operate in isolation. Pappy guns conversions were deployed within a broader tactical framework that learned to coordinate high-altitude distractions and low-level pounding. Large American formations would use heavier bombers, B-17's, in higher altitude runs to present a present but distant threat, prompting the convoy to look upward and diffuse focus. Then, in waves beneath that high cloud, squadrons of B-25's, modified as strafers, would run in low. The diversionary high-altitude bombs and the dreadfully visible immediate threat of low-level guns worked in combination. While the escorts tracked the bigger threat, the strafers targeted the ship's defensive nodes, finding gaps in attention and turning discipline into liability. This was not just technical novelty, it was a tactical inversion of assumptions. Convoy discipline kept ships in mutual support, but that discipline meant that once one ship was disabled, others were impeded, forming easier targets rather than independently evasive units. The 8-gun strafer made the escort's mutual defense a double-edged sword. Their mandates to hold course, to protect transports by occupying positions between attackers and the ships, now placed them directly in the path of sustained machine gun fire, capable of cutting command bridges and searchlights in seconds. The psychological effect was immediate. Where crews could once rely on layered flak and evasive turns, they now faced a new kind of close-in hail of fire that aimed not at the hull alone, but at the sensors, men and machinery that made defense possible. The development arc from 4 guns to 8 did not happen in a clean laboratory. It was messy, iterative, and driven by the immediate pressing problem of losing men and materials across the vastness of the Pacific. Field modifications were justified in pragmatic terms. The factory could not deliver the doctrinal weapon fast enough, and the theater needed something that could reach across water and hit weight where it counted. Jack Fox, the North American aviation representative on the ground, acted as connector and legitimizer, helping to translate field ingenuity into tolerable, semi-official practices that would not be immediately rejected by higher echelons, worried about structural integrity and factory warranties. That combination of local skill and semi-official endorsement allowed the strafer concept to spread among units operating out of forward bases. The technical description matters because it frames the tactical and strategic consequences. Consider the physics. An 50 caliber bullet from an M2 Browning under standard conditions carried substantial kinetic energy and could penetrate the thin plating used on bridge structures, gun shields, and light superstructure. M8 API rounds added incendiary effect to that penetration. An 8-gun volley produced overlapping trajectories of fire that were hard to avoid at close range. The aggregate volume of fire created what frontline crews called a wall of lead, less poetic than literal, but accurate in effect. Ships' light armor, wooden fittings, canvas, exposed fuel lines and munitions on deck presented many sources for secondary fires once the initial rounds punctured. A ship's ability to fight depended not only on its watertight compartments, but also on intact observation posts, functioning guns, and crew cohesion. The strafer attacked all 3. Field accounts emphasize that the window between initial hits and defensive collapse could be measured in minutes. A strafing burst that shredded a bridge could blind a ship tactically. Subsequent skip bombs that struck near the waterline could produce catastrophic flooding. The combination, suppression plus precision hull strikes, removed options for the defenders. Where earlier air attacks often left ships maneuvering, damaged but afloat, the Strafe's profile increased the likelihood of rapid loss. The casualty lists that flowed from those losses were severe, and it is important to treat them with solemnity. Large numbers of troops embarked for transit and supply found themselves without the protection of a fighting ship, and rescue operations then became desperate affairs conducted among burning hulks and floating debris. For the Imperial Navy, the shock was not merely numerical, it was doctrinal. Convoys had felt secure because of their layered defenses. Now they saw new vulnerabilities that required rethinking of escort tactics, dispersion, and even the basic assumptions of how to move men and material across contested seas. The operational consequences of these tactical shifts began to be visible in the weeks and months after Eagle Farm's modifications saw combat. Forward garrisons, which relied on regular convoys for food, ammunition, replacement men, and medicine, found their resupply windows closing as transport losses rose and the risk calculus favored fewer, more cautious operations. In island warfare, supply is sword and shield alike. An isolated garrison cannot sustain operations without steady resupply, and the loss of supply convoys can create cascading collapses across a front. The Bismarck Sea engagement, where the combination of strafe and skip bombing was used at scale against a major convoy, produced precisely such a cascade. Ships that might have weathered occasional hits found themselves in burn piles. Troops prepared to reinforce and relieve hard-pressed garrisons instead met death or a long, uncertain evacuation. The loss of materiel and the debilitating psychological effect on Japanese naval planners forced a re-evaluation of how to protect supply lines, and that re-evaluation came at a cost. All of this led to rapid institutional friction. Field innovations like the Strafer often sat uneasily alongside formal development cycles. Factory engineers worried about structural overloading. Admiralties worried about encouraging unsanctioned modifications. But in theatres where the distance from the factory to the front was measured in thousands of miles, and where delay equaled vulnerability, practical solutions that improved immediate survival were hard to ignore. Within weeks, the evidence of effectiveness pushed the doctrine. More B-25's were modified, tactics were written down, and a lineage of gunship thinking began to take shape. The Strafer did not remain a curiosity. It became a template, an example of how concentrated, adaptable firepower could change the balance of sea versus air. To understand how theory met flesh, we must return to the morning in the Bismarck Sea and follow the convoy's last hours in closer detail. The Imperial convoy left on a timetable to move thousands of men to a forward base, carrying roughly 6,900 troops according to some sources. Verify. Embarkation was dense. Transports packed men and supplies in ways that maximized space at the expense of survivability. Escorting destroyers kept station and watched for air threats, confident in their AA umbrella. Overnight reconnaissance had reported nothing unusual, and by dawn the convoy sailed under a deceptive calm. From the American side, interdiction planning had matured. Reconnaissance had found the convoy and signaled its course. Higher altitude heavy bombers simulated threat profiles, while radio-silent, low-level B-25's prepared in squadrons for a coordinated attack. Squadron leaders ran through familiar checklists: trim, fuel, bomb release timing, gun feed checks. Pilots and gunners understood the plan. Approach at wave-top level, maintain formations that allowed overlapping fields of fire, open up at the calculated ranges, and then place skip bombs to break hulls. On the bridge of one of the convoy's destroyers, a small knot of officers scanned the horizon. The morning light made the sea look deceptively placid. Visibility was good. Below decks, troops speculated about what awaited them. Those aboard transports saw only the ordered routine of transit. Drills, guarded holds, the lurch of ship against wake. No one could see from below how vulnerability accumulated in such ordinary moments. How close quarters and packed gear turned a damaged ship into a conflagration. How the lack of rapid evacuation planning made rescue a matter of time and chance. At first contact, the air campaign executed its diversion. B-25's at altitude took up positions that would draw eyes and some fire upward. Shipboard radar and visual watchers tracked the heavy bombers. Then, like a cut in a film, the lower echelon came in. Squadrons of B-25's, trimmed with modified noses, hesitated at wave level and then surged. The approach was almost theatrical in its precision. Formations flattened to ride the sea's skin, engines straining for the right speeds, the smell of oil and hot metal sharpening in the cramped cockpits. As the B-25's reached their opening ranges, pilots judging by practice, by sight, by the span of the ship's silhouette, they broke into strafing runs. The effect was immediate. In the first seconds, the concentrated .50 caliber fire shredded exposed platforms, splintered wooden railings, and ignited canvas and fuel lines. Bridge crews found their instruments peppered, their communication lines severed, their observation posts riddled with holes. On at least one escort, rounds cut the bridge into ruin, leaving command in confusion. The transports, designed primarily for cargo and human carriage rather than combat, suffered intense damage to deck fittings, lifeboats, and superstructure. The 8-gun noses produced overlapping streams of tracer and flash that turned the forward arcs of the ships into artists' strokes of smoke and sparks, vivid, brutal, and efficient. It is at this point that the narrative tightens. Strafing did not simply wound, it prepared the target for the skip bombs that followed. A skip bomb that hit at the waterline would, in many cases, doom a ship already tactically blinded. Fire spread, bulkheads failed, and the chain of command on the deck of a transport was fractured by smoke and shrapnel. Rescue efforts launched from neighboring ships had to contend with the same lethal field of action: burning decks, floating wreckage, survivors struggling in oil-slicked water. Eyewitness accounts later described scenes of desperate improvisation: rafts cut loose, men stripped of uniforms to keep afloat, medics treating wounds on listing keys of steel. But those accounts are best handled with careful sourcing, and when found ambiguous or contradictory, flagged for verification. As the morning's attack unfolded, decisions once taken for granted became fraught. Escort commanders had to choose between chasing attackers, attempting to cover survivors, or maintaining formation to protect remaining transports. Each option carried risk. The Japanese command, watching the scatter of smoke and flame, sent urgent radio traffic that reflected both tactical surprise and the dawning recognition that a new kind of threat had materialized. In the hours that followed, the tally of ships damaged and sunk would make grim news across the Imperial Navy. The immediate human toll in soldiers and sailors lost or injured, and the strategic toll, the loss of a vital reinforcement convoy, would ripple outward, forcing reassessments of how to move men and material under air threat. Even as fires burned and boats sank, observers on both sides understood that the Bismarck sea engagement was not an isolated anomaly. The methodology, field innovation coupled with a doctrinal tweak that favored suppression and precision, promised to be repeatable. That realization produced a kind of institutional tectonics. Admiralty staffers and theatre commanders convened, wrote reports, and debated countermeasures. Japanese recommendations ranged from altered escort patterns to changes in convoy timing and more aggressive fighter cover, yet none of these fixes came without logistical costs. More fighters meant fewer available elsewhere. Dispersed convoys reduced mutual support. nocturnal movement increased navigation risks and the chance of submarine attack. The strafers' effect was therefore not simply in sinking ships, it was in inserting a costly dilemma into the strategic calculus of an overstretched navy. At the same time, American planners faced their own dilemmas. Field modifications would have to be standardized, maintenance and supply lines adjusted, and pilots trained in the new high-risk, low-altitude approaches. The impulse to institutionalize the Strafe was strong. The modification offered a practical, scalable capability that Allied logic and equipment could expand. The B-25J production variants later incorporated more robust forward armament as official features, reflecting how battlefield success can force factory changes. In the longer arc, the Strafe's core idea, integrating heavy sustained machine gun fire with precise localized bombing, echoed through post-war thinking, informing gunship concepts that appeared decades later in entirely different contexts. But these broader legacies remained to be fully understood, and in March 1943, the immediate horizon was dominated by the grim arithmetic of ships burning and men in the water. The morning's attack did not unfold as a clean narrative of cause and effect, because war seldom does. It unfolded as a series of choices and failures, of material improvisations hitting doctrinal weak points, and of human beings reacting under fire. Pappy Gunn's improvised 8-gun nose had transformed the geometry of engagement, but it had also exposed deeper vulnerabilities in logistics and command. The convoy's losses were both tactical and symbolic, a practical demonstration that supply lines, the arteries of any campaign, could be struck in ways previous doctrine had not fully anticipated. As the smoke rose and the sea around the convoy filled with lifeboats and oil slicks, commanders on both sides began drafting the lessons that would change how the Pacific was fought. Japanese naval staffers queried whether convoy formations should be dispersed, whether escorts should prioritize rescue or defense, and how fighter coverage could be improved. American planners weighed the costs of scaling up field modifications against the benefits of formal production and doctrinal training. Men who had improvised in hangars, Gunn and his mechanics, watched from their bases as their work was validated in the cruelest of tests. That validation, however, came at a terrible price in lives and material. The story at this hinge raises immediate, unresolved questions. How many of those embarked were saved, and how many were lost? Sources diverge on numbers, and some figures remain to be verified. Verify. Which ship names and commanders recorded in field reports require careful cross-checking for accurate spelling and attribution. Verify. And perhaps more importantly, how did the Imperial Navy reorganize after this shock to create defensive measures that would blunt or adapt to the Strafe's tactics? Those are the questions that take us beyond the tactical vignette and into strategic analysis, and they are the questions historians and researchers must pursue with both rigor and sensitivity. For now, the immediate scene remains. Burning ships drifting like hulks in the morning light, survivors clinging to debris, escorts maneuvering under smoke, and the machines that delivered this outcome. B-25's with heavily reinforced noses and 8 chattering 50-caliber mouths, circling back to their bases with the dull aftermath of success on their wings. The technical innovation had achieved a brutal clarity. The tactical payoff was unmistakable, but the longer consequences, operational shocks, institutional change, and the human stories embedded in body counts and survivor testimonies were only beginning to unfold. The conversion of a medium bomber into a dedicated anti-shipping platform had demonstrated an important truth about modern war. Modest, pragmatic changes at the human scale, when combined with a suitable tactic and opportunity, can rip strategic fissures in even disciplined and experienced adversaries. What remained in the days that followed was to trace those fissures outward, to see how supply lines tightened, how garrisons found themselves denied relief, how naval doctrine shifted gears, and how the strafer, born of improvisation, found a place in standardized production and later inspired more deliberate gunship concepts. Those threads, technical, tactical, operational and human, interweave, and to follow them is to understand not only how metal and bullets did their work, but how human decisions, ingenuity, and institutional inertia together shaped an entire theatre of war. What unfolded in the hours after the burning hulls were left behind was less a tidy after-action than a slow unspooling of consequence. Search and rescue, report writing, political ripples, and the quiet, bureaucratic work of translating a sudden tactical success into sustainable capability. The immediate physical picture was grim and clear. By noon, the sea around the convoy was a field of debris. Broken decking, overturned lifeboats, clothing, personal effects, and the black ribbons of oil. Survivors hung to anything that floated. Rescue launches and whatever escorts remained worked to pull men from the water, but they did so with the weight of loss already heavy in their hands. The transports that had carried thousands were now either lists of fire or sinks. A handful of destroyers and escort ships had themselves been holed or burned, their crews exhausted from fight and rescue alike. Among American air crews flying home across the Coral Sea, the mood was a mixture of numb relief and grim awareness. They had tested a concept in combat and seen results that matched, in cold arithmetic, the calculations made in hangars and briefing tents. Suppression, then precision, a short window of overwhelming fire, followed by a bomb that found the hull. Men removed oily clothing, stripped away flight gear, and sat while mechanics checked the strain on airframes, pushed to extremes by heavy noses and sustained low-level flight. Pappy Gunn walked among them in a way that mixed the spare pride of an artisan with the quiet fatigue of a man whose work had found its terrible validation. He had not planned a massacre, he had tried to solve a problem. The human cost, faces in the water, bodies on rafts, was now part of that solution's price. The Japanese naval staff in Rabaul and Tokyo received fragments of radio traffic and field reports and began to stitch together an account of what had happened. For the staff officers translating smoke and sinking steel into doctrine, the answer was soon framed as a failure of the convoy model under a new form of air attack. The immediate proposals that circulated among commanders included dispersing convoys, increasing fighter escort allocations, shifting sailing times to night movements, and resorting more frequently to destroyer runs for reinforcement. Fast, small shipments that could risk less once daylight air power proved decisive. Each remedy carried trade-offs. Dispersion reduced mutual defense. More fighters meant diverting aircraft from other pressing fronts. Night sailings increased navigational hazards and submarine risk. The strategic reality of Japan's Pacific posture, stretched lines, finite shipbuilding capacity, limited trained pilots, meant that none of the remedies were free. The Bismarck sea losses had not merely removed a number of transports and troops from the board. They had added friction to an already complex logistical system and forced commanders to make painful choices that would echo across months. Historians and technicians would later point to 3 layers of consequence from that one operation. First was the tactical, the demonstration that a medium bomber, modified in the field with concentrated forward firepower and paired with skip bombs, could disable and sink transports with efficiency and speed previously unexpected. Second was the operational, the loss of men, materiel, and time in resupply windows for forward garrisons, units that could no longer count on regular, safe shipments of food, ammunition, and replacements. Third was the strategic, the shift in Japanese planning that increasingly favored smaller, risk-tolerant movements and diverted scarce resources into convoy protection, thereby limiting offensive initiative elsewhere. The Bismarck Sea is best understood in this nested way. The tactical means, 8 barrels of 50 caliber fire and a correctly timed skip bomb, was the proximate instrument. The operational result, garrisons cut off, plans delayed, and forces undersupplied, was the medium-term effect. The strategic reverberation, the limitation on Japanese capacity to sustain or expand positions in the Southwest Pacific, took longer to register on the maps and in the balance of campaigns, but it was no less real. A more granular reading of immediate naval decisions after the attack shows how doctrines recalibrated. In the week after March 30, commanders in the area reduced the use of large daytime troop convoys to Lae and Salamaua, verify specifics and timelines. Instead, they dispatched smaller, faster destroyer runs at night when possible, the tactic that Western historians frequently label under the colloquial Tokyo Express rubric, verify scope and term usage in this theater. The logic was simple. If aerial interdiction at daylight made large, steady convoys untenable, the alternative was to accept higher operational risk in other dimensions, more wear on destroyers, fewer troops per run, and an erosion of logistical throughput. The net effect was a choked supply pipeline. Garrison units that had depended on regular reinforcement and resupply began to stall. Some positions could be maintained through sheer effort and improvisation. Many could not. In the arithmetic of island warfare, deprived of steady logistics, a forward base could go from viable to isolated in weeks. Japanese commanders did not view the problem as merely technical. It became a matter of doctrine and organizational adaptation. Staffs convened boards to study the role of air power in interdicting sea lines of communication and how best to mitigate it. Recommendations ranged in scope and impatience. Move convoys at night, change routes, increase fighter cover, strengthen escort armament, or even adopt decoy traffic to draw off attackers. Military institutions, however, move with the friction of politics and production realities. More fighters could not be conjured overnight. Reassignments cost lives elsewhere. Destroyer escort was limited by the sheer number of convoys and the distance between bases. Over the next several months, those limitations showed in attrition figures and in the cautiousness of Japanese operational planning. The American side faced its own institutional problem, how to convert a field improvisation into a doctrine that could be taught, supplied, and sustained. Guns conversions had been practical and at times rough-hewn. For greater scale, standardization was necessary. Engineers at North American and U.S. Army Air Force's staff officers could not simply allow every crew to apply ad hoc fixes. Issues of structural fatigue, center of gravity shifts, ammunition supply, and long-term maintainability had to be resolved. The B-25J, whose production line was already adaptable, became the factory vessel for the strafer concept. Later built J variants accepted more robust nose armament as part of their design packages, moving the innovation from field expedient to manufactured feature. Verify specific production changes and timelines. That transition required paperwork and dollars as much as ingenuity. At the aircrew level, tactics hardened. Training syllabi added low-level approach drills, skip bombing practice, and coordinated strafing runs. Maintenance schedules changed to account for heavier nose loads, brakes, landing gear, trim settings, and engine tune-ups all needed attention when aircraft flew closer to the sea's skin and carried additional forward weight. Ammo logistics followed the guns. Units needed steady resupply of 50 caliber belts and of M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds in particular, because the incendiary element was key to creating secondary fires on ship decks and among cargo. The intimate interplay of supply, training, and aircraft maintenance underlined a persistent truth of wartime innovation. Victory at scale requires not only a better weapon, but the organizational will and logistics to field it broadly. Technical questions that would animate engineers and historians for years are often those flagged by field crews at the time. How did 8 guns affect handling characteristics at low altitude and high speed? What was the impact on stall margin during skipped bomb delivery? What were the limits of sustained fire before barrels overheated or feed systems jammed? Field crews documented experiences, barrel heating, feed reliability, and stress on the nose skin among them, and the factory department looked to solve these problems with design changes in production aircraft. These technical debates were not arcane. They shaped whether the strafer remained a niche curiosity or became a doctrine-bearing tool. There is also the matter of human adaptation. The crews who flew strafing runs did so under enormous personal hazard. Low-level flight over water invites small errors to become fatal ones. It increased exposure to small arms and light AA fire that could easily disable an engine or a control surface. For gunners, the concentration of targets produced intense, short-duration stress. The need to synchronize bursts across barrels, to keep fire on target while pilots adjusted approach, and to shift quickly to bomb release once the suppression window closed. Training mitigated, but did not eliminate danger. Those who returned alive spoke of strange mixtures of clarity and distance during the strikes. Tunnel vision, focused on sight picture and instrument readings, and yet acutely aware after the fact of the carnage below. On the Japanese side, micro-scenes in command rooms revealed the human side of doctrinal shock. Admirals and staff officers who had grown used to a certain pattern of losses in convoy transit now grappled with an instrument that defied prior expectations. Some officers argued for technical remedies, improved radar, more distributed anti-aircraft mounts, increased armor on critical bridges and pilot houses. Others proposed operational changes, night movements, more aggressive fighter patrols, or altered convoy routing. All options exacted a price in resources, time, or tactical flexibility. Within months, the Japanese Navy reduced the scale of daylight troop convoys in that part of the theater. That strategic reticence was itself consequential. It ceded initiative in certain places and allowed Allied forces to apply pressure in ways that were previously more costly. The loss of shipping in the Bismarck Sea had an arithmetic. A single convoy could carry thousands of men, tons of supplies, vehicles, ammunition, and fuel. Items that could not be easily replaced once lost in the sea. Replacement required more ships, more fuel, and more escorts, resources in short supply. The net operational effect was to reduce the tempo at which the Japanese could reinforce forward positions. In some cases, forward commanders had to choose between feeding existing garrisons and mounting new offensives. The immediate tendency was conservation. Hold what you have. That tendency allowed Allied operations on New Guinea and adjacent islands to exploit thin points in Japanese logistics, tightening encirclements and applying pressure where supply was now uncertain. Wider strategic consequences unfolded as battles of attrition, logistics, and morale. A theater commander who cannot reliably move reinforcements faces a hard limit on strategic options. That is where the strafer's effect becomes visible at scale. An improvised field modification did not dispel Japanese naval power overnight. It imposed a new constraint. When commanders must calculate not only the enemy's fleet, but also the reliability of their own lines of communication, operational bravado declines, campaign plans become conservative, offensives are postponed or cancelled, local initiative stalls. In warfare, time is a resource as valuable as ammunition. The strafer's success bought time for Allied planners to press advantages elsewhere with reduced risk of immediate Japanese counter-reinforcement. As March became April and the months turned, the strafer became part of a larger mosaic of Allied anti-shipping operations that increasingly stressed Imperial Japan's capacity to hold forward positions. Engineers refined production models, tactics codified into doctrine, Air crews learned to measure their approach to the yardstick of practiced, lethal brevity. Enough lead to blind and suppress, enough bomb placement to flood a ship, then out. The strait of resource management, who received fighters, who got escorts, which convoys moved, was no longer a purely Japanese argument. It had become a shared constraint in the theatre's contest for initiative. The lineage of the strafer idea is instructive. Conceptually, it connects a line from improvised nose guns on medium bombers to the intentional gunship concept that reappeared decades later. The AC-47 Spooky of the Vietnam era and the AC-130 gunship that followed shared a common nucleus of thinking. Concentrated, sustained, direct fire from fixed-wing aircraft could dominate ground or sea targets in ways that ordnance dropping alone could not. The A-10's design philosophy, an aircraft built around a powerful forward gun to deliver accurate, survivable close air support, also echoes the strafer's central insight that forward-mounted high-volume fire can decisively influence a localized engagement. That does not mean the B-25 strafer was a direct technical ancestor in every design feature. It means the conceptual idea, a dedicated airframe employing sustained direct fire to suppress and destroy localized, hardened, or dispersed targets, found later functional cousins in very different contexts and with very different technologies. Institutional recognition of the strafer's value was uneven but real. Manufacturers incorporated heavier noses into later B-25 builds. The Army Air Forces codified skip bombing training in theater manuals and distributed lessons learned across units operating in similar roles. The field's improvisation, grounded in empirical proof, pushed organizations that were otherwise conservative into grudging acceptance. Guns' role was acknowledged in after-action reports and by air crews. Jack Fox and other technical representatives provided the necessary bridge to formal engineering channels that allowed the modification to move from hangar to factory line. Over time, the strafer's techniques became less an improvisation and more an option in the Allied playbook. Yet the story also carries subtle cautions. Tactical innovation does not automatically translate into strategic invincibility. The strafer could be countered by more aggressive fighter cover, by dispersal of shipping, by night movement, by improved radar and coordination. Moreover, the very success of such attacks invites adaptation. An enemy will learn, and learning may blunt the initial advantage. Those dynamics, innovation, exploitation, countering adaptation, are a constant in military history. The Bismarck Sea episode showed how quickly an improvised advantage could translate into operational effect. It also showed that the advantage required continued commitment to training, production, and sustainment to preserve. The human stories threaded through these technical and institutional developments demand solemn attention. Survivors of the convoy, pulled from oil-streaked water by small boats and battered destroyer crews, later described chaotic rescues, men coughing and clinging, medics fishing shrapnel from bodies, ship doctors working through blistered skin and fractured limbs. For many soldiers who had expected only the routine terror of jungle warfare ahead, the sea became their grave. Emergency escorts returned with lists of names that would be passed by families and command alike for months. The loss remade lives far from the operational maps, letters not written, children bereft of fathers, promotions halted by death. For the air crews who had landed, those rescue scenes were a moral residue that did not wash off with oil and fuel. Many wrote, later in debriefs, of the dissonance between a successful mission and the visual memory of men in the water. Institutional histories might catalogue the strategic gains, but the human cost remained in letters, in funerals, and in the private reckonings of survivors. Accuracy around the details of the Bismarck Sea engagement remains critical to preserving this story's integrity. There remain points that require precise verification in the archival record. The exact list of ships sunk, The precise casualty counts among embarked troops and crew, sources diverge on total embarked and those who survived, verify, the complete roster of Japanese escorts and their commanders. Some field reports list destroyers such as Shirayuki and Tokitsukaze, verify precise spellings and attributions, and the formal production changes to later B-25J models. Where eyewitness accounts conflict, scholars must triangulate with ship logs, action reports, and official correspondence. Where numbers differ widely in secondary sources, conservatism in reporting and explicit flags for verification are the historian's obligation. In the months after, the theatre's maps slowly reflected the operational consequences. Points that had seemed tenable with steady supply now required more careful calculation. Allied amphibious operations, and the gradual rolling back of Japanese positions on New Guinea and the Solomon Islands exploited openings that logistical pressure created. The loss of a single convoy, dramatic as it was, must be read alongside other attritional factors. Submarine warfare, carrier strikes, the cumulative attrition of trained pilots and ships, and the expanding Allied industrial advantage. The strafer was a potent instrument in a broader set of capabilities that together imposed unsustainable strain on Japanese maritime logistics. Historically, the B-25 strafer's story also offers a broader lesson about how small-scale innovation can cascade. Gunn and his team were not a corporate R&D group. They were a field crew with experience, access to materials, and a pressing problem. Their success exposes an enduring military truth. The operational environment often rewards those who can adapt quickly and then institutionalize that adaptation before the enemy adapts back. The organizational challenge that follows is to translate expedient improvisation into a sustainable, maintainable, and scalable capability. In the strafer's case, that translation occurred because American production, training and logistical systems could amplify the modification's tactical effect into broader operational practice. The enemy faced a harder problem. Japanese industrial and logistical constraints made rapid, comprehensive counterchange more difficult. As the conflict moved forward, the strafer's concrete legacy can be seen in a handful of traceable pathways. The factory-produced B-25J variants adopted heavier noses and standardized armament, making the strafer profile part of the Mitchell family's official repertoire. Verify exact production numbers and changes. Tactical writings integrated skip bombing and suppression runs into island-hopping operations as a method of attacking coastal shipping and supported landings. And on a doctrinal level, the strafer validated a way of thinking that aircraft designed or modified to deliver concentrated, sustained fire could dominate a localized target in ways bombs alone could not. That way of thinking resurfaced in Cold War and post-war air power design debates. Gunships, armored close air support platforms, and precision-guided munitions all sat in a lineage that includes guns improvisation as an ancestral node in a broader conceptual tree. The story's final day-by-day arc is a sober one. Tactical innovation produced immediate devastation. That devastation translated into operational headaches for an overstretched Navy. Operational constriction produced strategic limits on Japanese options in the Southwest Pacific. Yet none of this erased the cost in human life or muted the ethical burden of wartime innovation. The strafer's success was not a cause for celebration, but a prompt for reflection on how warfare adapts, on how institutions respond, and on what it means for technology to be applied against human targets. Pappy Gunn and his mechanics may rightly be credited with ingenuity. The dead and the drowning must be remembered with dignity and restraint. On the bridge of a still smouldering escort ship weeks later, a captain wrote a terse report on lessons learned, what to change, where to allocate resources, which tactics to avoid. The report would be one file among many in the Admiralty's larger response to the evolving air threat. In a hangar back in Brisbane, crewmen replaced worn gun barrels and checked mounting plates, their hands skilled from repetition, their faces quieter now with the knowledge that their work mattered strategically and cost the lives of many. In Tokyo, staff officers debated convoy doctrine in maps and charts, each recommendation a compromise between scarcity and necessity. The B-25 strafer did not single-handedly win the Pacific. No single weapon ever does. But in the domain where supply, timing and movement determine the possibility of operations, the strafer forced a reallocation of resources and a rethinking of risk that advantaged the Allies across a crucial theatre. It exposed vulnerabilities in existing defensive systems, compelled doctrinal adaptation, and drew a line through the theatre's logistical fabric that could not be easily mended. The conversion of hundreds of hours of inventive labor in a Brisbane hangar into an operational capability that sank ships and altered enemy planning is a story about the uneven alchemy of war, improvisation meeting opportunity, yielding consequence. If one lesson stands out from the B-25's episode, it is this: tactical ingenuity, when paired with an operationally suitable tactic and sufficient organizational support, can stretch into strategic effect. The 8-gun nose did not win the Pacific by itself, but it helped create conditions that constrained Japanese options and increased the costs of sustaining distant garrisons. It also contributed to an intellectual heritage in which aircraft could be thought of, not simply as bombers or reconnaissance platforms, but as platforms for concentrated direct fire, an idea that would reappear in various forms across the 20th century. In remembering this episode, historians and viewers alike must hold two truths together: the cold mechanics of innovation and the human consequences of its application. Pictures of a modified bomber and technical descriptions of armor-piercing incendiaries tell part of the story. The faces of men in the water, the reports of medics, the decisions that an admiral must make while looking at a map. These complete the moral and operational picture. The strafer's history is therefore both a technical case study and a human story about the costs and calculations of modern war. For those who study military history, the B-25's 8-gun nose is a striking exemplar of how field adaptation can shape a campaign. For those whose relatives or ancestors were near those waters on that March morning, it is a reminder of the human toll that accompanies even the most brilliant invention. For engineers and doctrine writers, it is a reminder that practical field solutions deserve careful attention when the factory cannot move fast enough, and that institutionalizing such solutions requires patient, sometimes painful, attention to training, logistics, and maintenance. The narrative concludes in a place of sober synthesis. The 8 guns of the B-25's nose were not merely metal and ammo. They were a concentrated expression of a theater's tactical problem solved at the human scale. The resulting tactical shock at the B-25's produced cascading operational limitations for an overstretched Navy and helped shape the logistical and doctrinal environment in which subsequent campaigns were fought. That legacy, technical, operational, moral, remains part of the record, demanding careful study and respectful remembrance. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more field-tested histories and let us know below if someone in your family served in the Pacific.